Willkommen in einer Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 2 of my Napoleonische-Kriegsführung video series. In this video I'll be providing an overview of Napoleonische-Kriegsführung, or Napoleonic warfare in English, or simply NKF rules. NKF version 2 is based on the Corps Commander version 6 quick play game system, which in turn is based on the Corps Commander 1986 to 1988 rules. Corps Commander and Corps Commander are both designed for 20th century conflicts, so it's not what you would expect to be suitable for Napoleonic warfare. However, this has occurred in other cases. WRG Napoleonics was influenced heavily by WRG World War II rules, and Hoplite Research Group's Corps Commander influenced by Panzer Corps. Corps Commander version 6 game system has spawned a number of rules based on different scales, at least with myself, with Neue Divisional Commander, which uses a scale of 1 element equals 1 company, being the specific version I use for NKF version 2. The version 2 indicates this uses the game system which does not use strength points, which means all casualties are taken in whole elements. The primary driver of Corps Commander 6 was being a quick play set of rules, while retaining sufficient flavour to avoid becoming a chess-like set of rules. When considering the design of these rules, I needed to consider something that was quite significant. That is, any set of rules has to possess some unique attribute, otherwise players would be better off playing an existing set of rules. I firmly believe this. The unique aspect of these rules are that they are fundamentally big base rules which retains individual element movement and fire combat. Players who wish to play a set of rules which are element maneuver rules should consider DBN, WRG, or a host of other similar rules. Players who wish to play a set of rules which are truly big base rules, but you don't worry about the elements, should consider Blucher or possibly BBNB. Now, after the introduction, the caveats. I originally intended for these rules to be a good set of introductory rules. However, after attempting many test games, I discovered that while for a traditional figure game they are simple, but for new players they still retain traditional figure gaming complexity. The biggest issue was these rules attempted to duplicate Empire 3rd Edition, which was all about manoeuvring your forces into an attack formation and then moving forward. This is surprisingly hard to do, which means experienced players will always have an advantage over less experienced players. In the end, and many years ago when I designed these rules, I ended up moving to yet a simpler set of rules for new players. But now that my new players are in the hobby and are experienced, they are beginning to ask for more complexity. Rules such as Napoleon's Battles or the Age of Eagles were my initial thoughts, but they are still surprisingly complex, and I needed something which fitted in between, which is what NKF was originally designed to satisfy, and which now I come to the conclusion I need to probably go back to tweak and finish and add all the scenarios needed in order for me to use. Using these rules for a typical game, each side would consist of an army which ranges from between 50,000 and 100,000 men per side. The smaller number is almost certainly recommended. Each player's army consists of between 4 to 6 corps-sized formations. This does depend on the period, as early corps were rather small, while later corps were rather large. The sub-commanders' values will vary based on the size of corps which they are commanding, as it's assumed later larger corps possessed superior staff capabilities. Within each corps, players form divisions or brigades. These are abstract in the rules, possessing no commander, and are simply defined by whichever elements are in base-to-base contact with each other at that point in time. These rules do not focus on the detail of divisional or brigade structures, although players certainly can arrange their elements historically if they so desire. In practice, a lot of mixing occurred within corps-sized formations in real battles, especially concerning cavalry and artillery, so I suspect the abstract view is probably the more historically accurate. The ground scale for this rules is 1 in 5,000 for 15 mil, which means a playing area which is 4 feet wide could represent a battlefield which is 6 kilometres wide. Marengo, which is a small battle, I must admit, was about 2 kilometres wide, for example, so this would represent about 30 centimetres. The number of elements on the Austrian side was about 25 elements for this particular battle, which did include the flanking forces, which operated well beyond the 2 kilometre front line distance or width. This should allow you to see these rules encourage solid front lines which have some depth, normally 2 elements on average. Each game turn represents 60 minutes, which is a significant factor. It took the Austrians 2 hours to form up for an attack against the French at Marengo, and this lasted for about 3 hours, that is the attack. You quickly see a player would expend 2 to 3 game turns forming up their troops and then launching an attack which would last for possibly another 2 to 3 game turns. This would result in one side falling back and in many cases ending the battle. Larger battles would typically take longer to form up and the combats would last longer, mainly because the front line would consist of lots of smaller localised conflicts which would have their own tempo. This is modelled very much on the Empire 3rd edition concept for those familiar with those rules. In the rules, each infantry figure represents about 250 men, cavalry figures about 200 men, and artillery 12 artillery pieces. The figure scale is not that important. This is really very much an element-based set of rules. This means each line infantry element represents about 1,000 men, each cavalry about 400 cavalry, and each artillery element 12 guns. Light infantry represents 750 men per element, although normally you would base it still at 1,000 men per element, and skirmishers about 500 men per element. That's 2 figures each. But nonetheless, the figure scale is not that relevant, it's the element scale. For those familiar with the old WRG rules, this is a similar ratio, but is designed to emphasise cavalry as much as possible, as I found gamers love cavalry. For those interested in the scale dynamics or structure, 1,000 men in 3 rank takes up a frontage of, let's say, about 200 metres. 400 cavalry in 2 ranks takes up a similar width, so there is a relationship. 12 guns in 1 rank with about 10 metres separation takes up about 150 metres. This could be less or could be more, and it did vary quite a bit. If 4 centimetre bases, that is if you're using bases which are 4 centimetres wide, is 200 metres, the scale is 1 in 5,000. Each element has a personal element class which can affect their ability to rally, which only occurs if the element was disrupted or routed or whatever the terminology you wish to use. The class can also affect close combat and fire combat values, which are listed in the equipment chart. Basically, morale affects close combat and skill represents fire combat. All other quality tests for an element uses the quality value derived from its commander. The sequence of plays starts with the initiative phase. During this phase, reinforcements are placed on the playing area edge, ready to enter. This includes troops which rally, which are placed on the playing area itself rather than the edge, as per the rally recovery rules. Each player then determines initiative, which affects player order. This also impacts what a player can do in their player turn. Weather change is determined, followed by the Elan subphase, which allows a player to gain an additional action if the initiative difference is great enough between each side. During the next phase, the fire and movement phase, each player can conduct, guess what? Fire and movement. The phasing player activates one commander at a time, who can now expend command points to activate subordinate combat units, which allow those combat units to move or conduct fire combat or conduct close assault. In simple terms, a combat unit expends an action to do whatever it so desires, fire, close assault, or move, followed by another action until all the actions for that element have been expended. If any close assault occurs, which normally occurs when opposing elements are in base-to-base contact, these are now resolved in the close combat subphase. The attacking combat unit and defending combat unit are now fully defined and the combat occurs. This continues one round after another until one side is eliminated or retreats. Once a phasing player commander has conducted all the movement in combat possible, another commander is activated on the same side, and the process is repeated for that commander and its core size formations. This continues until all the commanders have been activated. Once the phasing player has completed all fire and movement, this is then followed by the next phase, which is the opposing player conducting all fire and movement. The last step, or the steps I've just described, are now repeated for the opposing player. The last step in the sequence of play is to conduct housekeeping, which includes recovery and rallying elements. One note about routing and rallying: in these rules, when an element routes, it's removed from the playing area and the rally occurs off the playing area, and then the element is then placed back on the playing area if rallied. This is a little bit unique, and it's basically designed to simplify gameplay. Let's look at this process in a more diagrammatical form. Let's assume your army consists of 3 corps-size formations, shown here. The CNC first activates the commander on the left. The commander, or sub-commander, now uses command points to activate the entire corps as a single combat unit and expends 2 command points to activate the corps-size combat unit as a result. Depending on the size of the combat unit, the number of command points can vary. Once activated, this corps-size combat unit can conduct up to 2 separate actions, as it's a quality of 3. The quality is taken from the commander, who has a quality level of 3 or ordinary. The elements within the combat unit actually move individually, but for simplicity you can move it as a whole for gameplay purposes. You could even possibly put it in a tray if it makes sense. After expending one action to move forward, the second action is then used to conduct fire combat against a non-seen enemy element or combat unit to its front. The commander on the left has now expended all its actions for the current phasing fire and movement phase. The CNC now activates the commander on the right. In this case, the commander can activate the entire corps as a single combat unit as a cost of 2 command points, but the commander decides to divide this corps into 2 separate combat units, both of which take 1 command point to activate. Both also move in different directions and separates. You could do it either way. You could activate it as a single combat unit and separate it anyway, or you could activate them individually and move them separately. It's up to the individual sub-commander or player. All elements can conduct 2 actions in this case, which are both movement related. As you can see, the commander on the right, which has divided the corps into 2 separate combat units, the 2 separate combat units move and separate, which will affect the corps in the following phasing, movement and fire phase. Because all the elements are no longer in a single unit, that is, they're not all touching each other, they cannot be activated as a single combat unit. Not a big issue in this particular case, but nonetheless it can become an issue if the numbers of elements are slightly different to what you see here. The CNC now activates the final sub-commander, who will in turn activate the entire corps-size combat unit as a single combat unit, spending 2 command points, and conducts fire combat twice against a not seen enemy to its front. Those familiar with Empire 3rd Edition, you will see some familiarity here. The key to these rules is the fire and movement phase, and how the players move their elements, combat units, and also corps. We'll not be going through this much in this video, as it'll be covered in more detail in subsequent videos. As you may have been able to guess, this sequence of play is designed to simulate simultaneous movement and fire combat, while taking into account the corps were commanded by different commanders and may not perfectly align with the desires of the CNC. This allows you to have, in let's say a battle like Wagram, completely uncoordinated combats at various flanks. This concludes my rather short part 2 of my video on Napoleonische-Kriegsführung rules, in this case providing an indication or an overview and looking at the sequence of play. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.